Well, I'm really as honored and privileged to be a part of this as you made it sound like you are that I'm here. Thanks, Pook. Many of you I know have been to the Living Insight Center and know that some of our foundational principles, among others, are each person is entitled unconditionally to have whatever beliefs he or she does. And we should unconditionally love and accept each other despite our differences. And that's basically the sum of what I'm going to tell you. But I'm asked to talk for 10 or 12 minutes, so I'm going to try to add to that. And I'm also sure that I'm preaching to the choir quite literally over on this side of the room. Well, I'd like to start with a story. As some of you, like Pookie, would know, some years ago, the Living Insight Center had what we thought was a pretty wonderful vision. We hope to move our center, which is currently in a 2-story converted home, to the YMCA across the street. It's 24,000 square feet, and it ended up costing a lot more to do than we were able to afford. But we had some pretty wonderful ideas, I think, and one of those was that we were going to create in the gym what we were going to call a village of chapels. At the Living Insight Center, all the religions are condensed into one building, and not everybody is really comfortable walking past Buddha or Shiva to go see Jesus, that kind of thing. So we thought what we would do was create a village of chapels and give each of the major religions their own space. They'd all be the same size. None of them would have ceilings, so you'd be in this gym within a sense of oneness, but with the ability to go into your own space. And we thought it would be, really helpful to have representatives of the various faiths design and decorate and consecrate and then operate their spaces. And we knew that was going to be a challenge because it would mean getting the Catholics and the Protestants together and the Sunni and the Shia and the various forms of Judaism. And we knew it wasn't going to be easy, but that was part of the exercise, because if you can't get it together within your own faith, how are you going to get it together with everybody else? Well, as Pook mentioned, I've been involved in interfaith activities for, now about 11 years. And one of the things I participate in are the semi-annual dialogues of the world religions and philosophies. So they're held currently at St. Lucia University. About 250 people go. In the old days, it was maybe 80. And they're representatives of the various faiths that attend this. And I was given the opportunity to invite representatives of the faiths at 2 of these dialogues. And at one of them, the way these are set up, there's a panel discussion followed by breakout sessions where you can talk to the individual speakers. And at one of these, one of the panel discussion participants was the ecumenical officer of one of the major faiths in this community. And so he heard me speak, I heard him speak, and I thought, well, this is great. I was very naive at the time, I must say, because I thought this was a wonderful opportunity for me to get things started. So as soon as the panel was over, he went to his table. I went straight to him, and I began by just sort of very innocuously, I thought, asking, well, sir, not to give away his faith, what is it that your office as the ecumenical office does? And this was his response. I confess I was pretty taken aback, and I ask you to please understand, all of you, that this was his energy, not mine. Well, sir, it is certainly not what your organization does. As far as we're concerned, there is only one true faith, his, and we'll talk to the others, but that's as far as it goes. Just like that. Very ecumenical, wouldn't you say? So, I tell this story not as a reflection upon that man or even on his particular faith, but because that's not what this is about, but rather because I think this is something which is a general problem in our society. This story illustrates something that is fundamentally wrong in humanity as we try to create harmony among people of all faiths, and then beyond that, as we try to create harmony among people who differ in many ways. And I am devoted to religious matters. So I'm going to speak from that perspective, but I hope that the comments, the observations I will offer you will be taken in a broader context as applicable generally. Well, sadly, interfaith activities all too often suffer the fundamental weakness exemplified by this man. People simply have difficulty getting past the point of believing that their beliefs are the only ones that are right or best. And that this is not just a matter of religion, but we all tend to look at life through our own lens and think if we've got it figured out, well, surely it must be right. And there is some validation that comes if we start demeaning other people who don't see things the way that we do. So as a result, we're lucky if we even get people to the point of just respecting each other. But I submit that that is simply not enough. Respect is not enough. We need true loving acceptance and appreciation of each other, of one another, and this requires a fundamental change in our attitudes, in our way of living, our way of being. Well, we must begin by starting with the understanding that diversity is a good thing. Diversity is wonderful. It must be preserved. I knew it was the choir. And furthermore, diversity is simply unavoidable. Look around. How can we not be diverse? And there are a couple of metaphors I'd like to give that would illustrate the point I'm making here. Those of you who've been to Living Insights have already heard this before, because everybody who comes to Living Insights gets to hear this metaphor, and everybody who comes repeatedly gets to hear other people when they come the first time hear this metaphor. We see God, or with respect to people like Buddhists and others who don't wish to call it God, ultimate reality as an infinite clear light. And when that light shines through human consciousness, which is dense and finite, the light gets bent. We cannot absorb the entirety of that infinity. And we act like a prism. Individually, we bend that light to a color, which is our way of experiencing God and relating to God. Collectively, as a species, we act like a big prism, and we spread the light to all the colors. And people may gravitate around colors. There's a lot of Hindu oranges and so forth. But there's room in that spectrum for people who might be the only person that color in this entire community. And as beautiful as, well, first of all, the colors, none of them are the clear light. And no color is any less a color than anybody else's color. Now, as beautiful as the colors are windows to see the clear light. They invite us home, where we will return to the source of our being, go into direct communion with the source of our being, and drop our finite existence and become the infinite eternal beings that we are in our souls anyway. And you might call that heaven or paradise if you're from some cultures. You might call it enlightenment or nirvana if you're from another. But we're all headed there. Well, the second metaphor came to me from Swami Nishpapananda of the Vedanta Society. And I think it makes pretty much the same point. Visualize we are all standing in a circle pointing at the center. And the center is where our relationship with God can be consummated, if you will, where we'll go into conscious communion with God. And we're all pointing at that same point. But if you look at the circle, we're all pointing in different directions. Now, each of us will be pointing in a different direction, and yet we're all headed to the same point. And the direction that we are pointing is the direction that we must follow, but it's not the direction that anybody else in the circle must follow, because everybody's in a different place. Where we stand is where we came into the circle, and that reflects where we've come from, the path we've been on, the circumstances that we've dealt with, our own starting points. So we can't take somebody else's path. We might take a path that's similar, but our own path is our own path, and no one should tell us we need to get into their part of the circle. So religious tolerance does not mean that we're going to mix and match our religions and create one religion for everybody. I hope you all believe whatever you believe, and just let me believe what I believe, and let everybody believe that. Well, all of this to me seems so obvious. And yet people tell us the Living Insight Center is the only place in the world that's like this. There are places that honor all the world's religions, but at Living Insights, we try to teach them all and have authentic teachers in all of them and practice them all. Well, unfortunately, this is not the common view in society. And as just one illustration of this, I'd like to read a few brief excerpts from an article entitled, "Being a Christian in a Pluralistic Society." And this is by a professor at USC. He's not a minister, and I think that's kind of worth noting. So he says, pluralism means accepting diversity, if you're not familiar with the term. Pluralism simply means that social or political force is not to be used to suppress the freedom of thought and expression of any citizen. So far, so good. Pluralism does not mean that everyone is equally right in what they think and do. It does not mean that we must agree with the views or adopt the practices of those of other persuasions. It does not mean that we must like those views or practices. It does not mean that we will not appropriately express our disagreement or dislike for other viewpoints. Not necessarily quite so good now. Pluralism also does not mean that we will not try in respectful ways to change the views or practices of others. There can be little doubt that if the teachings and example of Jesus were generally followed in any given society, that society would be remarkably better off than any which followed any other way. I'm a Hindu. We must keep in mind that truth and reality are not in themselves pluralistic. I'm still reading him. If your gas tank is empty, social acceptance of your right to believe that it is full will not help you get your car to run. A 4,000-year-old tradition, Hinduism kind of uses that number, by the way, so I guess I could take this personally, but I'm not. That would not be right. A 4,000-year-old tradition does not become truer as the years go by. If it is false or wrong, it simply continues to be a long-standing error. Acceptance of its right to exist in a pluralistic society does not make it any more correct and will be of no help to those following it when they finally run into reality. Well, that's not the way I see things. Well, I believe that we unavoidably slide into conflict if we deign to assert or even deign to believe that our faith alone has all the answers or the only best ones. One might even think he's helping people, even saving them by guiding them to what he feels is the sole path to God. But how can anyone really be certain that they alone know the truth? It's one thing to say my religion is best for me, and it's a totally different thing to say my religion is best for all of you. Well, many of the people who visit Living Insights are frankly estranged from organized religions. Organized religions do, of course, serve many purposes, many valuable purposes, not the least of them being a means to preserve beliefs and traditions, practices over time, provide foundations for living, create community, and enable us to learn from each other. However, there's a strong current of people who believe that, with considerable justification, I might add, that when religion becomes organized, it becomes infected with things which arise from ego. Self-righteousness, turf battles, power grabs, large appetites for money and prestige, gender discrimination, and insensitivity. And there also seems to be good reason to suspect that some who seek power or safety or the comfort of certainty will seek these things by trying to gather supporters, all the while doing so with the rationalization that they're saving them. So too frequently we encounter powerful religious figures who seem to leave interfaith conversations sort of patting themselves on the back saying, "Oh, I'm such a good person for spending time with all these people who just don't get that they're wrong." There's even an international organization named the Foundation for Interreligious Diplomacy. The first large words, all caps, you see on the website are trustworthy opponents. And one of the, I'm not making this up. And one of their guiding principles is this: conflict over the things that matter most is ultimately irresolvable because we have no common metric for judging between ultimates based upon desires and subjective criteria. Hence, rather than trying to resolve conflicts over worldview and vision differences, we should strive to sustain healthy conflicts. Wow. Well, that's not the interfaith world I want to see. Instead, I submit that although, again, tolerance and peaceful coexistence are steps in the right direction, the type of harmony that we need can only come through sincerely loving acceptance and appreciation. So, how do we get there? Well, I believe we should start with the perspectives that I've already presented and then add at least two more guiding principles, which, again, I think aren't radical and they probably are not new to any of you. The first one is this: everything we experience, including each of us, has been created by God, with apologies to the Buddhists, and therefore is by its very existence sacred. Everything and everyone should be treated as sacred. In fact, from a Hindu perspective, everything and everyone actually is part of God, which is perceived as a sea of infinite energized consciousness. And from this perspective, everything we do and every thought we have is an interaction with God. And it affects literally everything because it's all God. So we really are one. And as a result, we must exercise great care in how we treat each other and how we treat the planet and every aspect, every particle of this planet. Amen. Thank you. And this also means we must transform ourselves into beings who are able to love everyone, and that includes people we don't like. We don't need to like what they do. We don't even need to like them, but we do need to love them. And it's probably worth noting that people who do bad things are generally doing them because they're suffering. And as a Greek philosopher said, be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a great battle. We're in this together. The second principle, which really restates some things I've already said, is this: God is infinite and our brains aren't, so any perceptions we have of God... I said it was pretty obvious. So anyway, so any perception we have of God must be incomplete. Religions are creations of finite human minds which are trying to make sense of something which is ultimately unknowable. So consequently, no one can possibly have all the answers or the only correct ones. A God who would create such a diverse universe, such diversity as we see here and beyond, surely would not only create one ideal way to relate to that God. And human beings have been using language for 150,000 years or something like that, yet none of the current faiths have existed in their present form, if at all, for more than 4,000 or 5,000 years. So, God bless you. So what hubris it is to think that any of the current religions has a monopoly on faith. Well, in conclusion, everyone suffers, everyone dies, everyone longs for peace and happiness and for an understanding of the great mystery. Standing before that great mystery, we all should be humbled and take comfort in knowing that we're not alone on the journey. Every person should be truly accepted and appreciated as a sacred being. Every person should be allowed to have his or her own experiences and beliefs, so long as no harm is done. We can offer our own beliefs, but don't impose them on anybody else. Love for one another has to outweigh our dislike of any of our differences. It is simply not enough. It's simply not enough to be tolerant and respectful. So in closing, I'm going to tell you one more brief story and then one last metaphor and then turn it back over. About a year ago, I gave a talk pretty similar to this one to a group of the really upper crust religious leaders in this community, the interfaith leaders. St. Louis prides itself on having an interfaith community that is one of the best in the country. There have been organizations meeting for about 25 years. And I was invited to give a talk along these lines to some of the leaders of that community. And after I gave this talk like this, an immense wave of emotion just burst out of the group. One of the prominent Jewish leaders started bashing the Christians in the room for evangelism. One of the Reformed Jews in the group started bashing the Orthodox Jewish leaders for being intolerant of their Reformed faith. And a bishop, a Mormon bishop, started crying. And he said that he had just been brought up before the authorities in his church for being too friendly to people of other faiths. And then he said, "But I love you all." And we need more leaders like that. And finally, I'd like to leave you with this image in deference to this part of the room in particular. A choir consists of many unique voices which combine to create beautiful harmonies. A choir collapses if any one part of the choir tries to consistently drown out all the others or run them off the stage. If we allow all of the singers to give voice to the notes for which we are suited, we can make beautiful music together, and in doing so, honor and give full expression to our composer. Thanks for listening.